Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Cal and I say that as the government of South Africa, we would institute a policy of mandatory circumcision at birth for all male children. You have no choice in the matter. As soon as you are born in the hospital, you are circumcised by the doctor. If you are born outside of the hospital, you are circumcised the first time you come in for a checkup when you're still too young to remember it. This is not mutually exclusive with adults circumcising themselves. Maybe you even want to provide financial incentives to do it. We're fine with that. It's not what we're talking about today, but in principle, we're okay with it. It's consistent. A factual premise before I get into my arguments, okay? Circumcision leads to a 60% reduction in AIDS transmission rates. Why does this matter? Because an AIDS transmission rate is only a 1 in 1,000 chance under the status quo, right? So when you reduce that to something like 1 in 2,500, actually you are getting a meaningful reduction in the size of the population that has AIDS within your country. Is this a clarification? No thanks. So this is a factual premise. I have nothing else on this, right? Just please accept this and we'll go with it. Okay. So I have 3 claims to you today. The first is about harm reduction and societal necessity. The second is about circumcision being appropriate in the South African context. And the third is about body rights. On to the first claim. I think what Cal and I would point to you is that South Africa is in a race against time to control the AIDS epidemic. What that means is that AIDS has growing direct and indirect costs upon the ability of your state to sustain itself in the face of people suffering from illness. The socially crippling effects of AIDS mean that you cannot wait for the ideal solutions, because if you wait for them to work, then 25 years down the line, you won't be able to pay for them anymore. You won't have the doctors. You won't have the resources. When currently you see that 29% of all pregnant women are infected with HIV, 11% of all South Africans above age 2 are infected with HIV. Any measure you can take, even if it is explicitly a stopgap measure that buys you time, we think is a duty of the state to institute in South Africa. The role of the state, and I'll take you after this point, is to take measures of universal necessity in order to protect the integrity of the state and its viability. We allow the state to implement drafts in the face of threats to national security. This is a threat to the nation. We think this policy is appropriate. Go ahead.
Since you're doing this to babies, you readily admit that this can't have any effect for 15 to 18 years. Correct?
Yeah. We think the AIDS epidemic will still be problematic in South Africa 15 to 18 years from now. And if that's their op, we're fine to stall that. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, circumcision in the South African context. So first, I just want to point out that even if used alone, it's still much better than having no protection, right? Even if you're using a condom, it's better to be circumcised if it protects you, because you always have a risk that the condom might break. So in that sense, it's a second line of protection. So it's always a benefit to the individual to be circumcised. It's also a benefit in South Africa because it's appropriate against a couple of alternatives. So one alternative is protection, right? Condoms. The problem we have there is the availability and the education that is necessary to use the solution in all cases. But furthermore, recognize that condoms prevent conception, right? A large amount of opposition to condom use in South Africa is due to fears that it is a scheme to keep population growth down. It is a scheme by outside actors. I think what that means then is that a solution like circumcision that has no effect, something that is already culturally accepted, is something that is actually much more likely to succeed in the short term. Something that is actually like a very good measure to take, something that fills in a necessary gap. Secondly, on education, right? So the resources for education are not something that the state can guarantee throughout the entire country. The accuracy of the education is not something that the state can guarantee in the entire country. Notice that circumcision, there is a system of clinics in South Africa. So for all of the Afrikaners what they did was they did set up a healthcare system that could circumcise everyone in the nation. And B, you don't need active intervention, and you can't use it wrong, right? This is especially important in the sexual act, when it is necessary that it be used correctly all the time, Mr. Speaker. So for condoms and for education, we certainly say continue these efforts. But if you use only these efforts and you do not have statewide circumcision, we just don't think you will have enough time for these efforts to work. There are systemic barriers against them working under the status quo. We think something like circumcision is appropriate. Go.
Yeah, you say it can't be seen as wrong, but the fact of the matter is if you start using this thinking it's like a vaccine, thinking you don't need condoms, then in fact you have a much better chance of ending up contracting HIV.
Cal has a really clever response to this.
Can't wait.
So the last thing is about body rights. Body rights is about airbags, actually. It's really cool. So the last point I have to talk about is about body rights. We would put to you that body rights are always instrumental, that you can violate them when the cause is sufficient, when the benefits are sufficiently large. I think there's an individual interest and there's a group interest. It's in your individual interest to have it done early, right? So I think from an original decision perspective, I would rather have it had done for the protections that it affords me later in life. I'd rather have it done as a baby so that I don't remember it, right? So that I'm not incapacitated when I'm 18 years old, so that I don't have to take time off work. People are much more likely to have it done. So far as parents usually make medical decisions, we don't think they have a stake in this role because it's always good for the baby, so it's not necessary to consult the parent. Secondly, we think so the example we use here is vaccines, right? Vaccines can harm you. Vaccines can cause deafness, and they can cause reactions, in extreme cases death. Vaccines are violations of your bodily integrity, but we force them upon people because we say that they protect the individual. What else do we force vaccines for? We do it for group interests. So recognize that what circumcision does is it makes you less of a danger to everyone in society. So not only are you protecting yourself, you're protecting everyone. It's a coordination problem in that you're willing to do it when everyone is willing to do it. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, I think you point to quarantine, right? When you are willing to actually invade people's ability to be mobile for the sake of protecting others within society. We think with circumcision you protect yourself and you protect everyone else. For all these reasons, we're proud to thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I think the fundamental flaw with the case we've just heard is that for there to be any sort of, for this to work in any sort of meaningful way, right, it has to come with an education campaign. The government has to change its policy. You will never solve AIDS in South Africa if the government continues to tell people that the CIA or Western countries are giving it to them, that condoms are designed to kill African people, or that a hot shower will save you, right? I think in no way does simply having circumcision, even though, yeah, it reduces your chance in that, we'll concede that, one time having sex. But if you're constantly having unprotected sex, you will still have an AIDS pandemic in Africa. So I'm going to introduce 3 constructive arguments. I'm going to talk about how this is a cop-out to AIDS education. It creates a psychological barrier for people, and it creates the sort of issues that have been so problematic and rife within the government in terms of miseducation around this disease and this pandemic. I'm going to talk about the real cause of the AIDS pandemic in South Africa, and why it's worse in South Africa than in other countries. Because if South Africa wasn't particularly problematic, right, if South Africa had the same AIDS problem as other countries, maybe this would make more sense. But there's clearly more going on in South Africa than is going on in a country like Botswana or Thailand. And lastly, I'm going to talk about how you fight AIDS. I haven't even started the argument yet, so Cass, please sit down. So a cop-out to AIDS education, right? You already have a situation in South Africa where you have the government deliberately spreading misinformation. Not sort of fringe NGOs, but the Minister of Health saying a hot shower is good, right? This is highly problematic. This is why you have an AIDS problem. What you're doing now is you're saying, oh, we've got this great solution. We're circumcising people at birth. And let's just for a second believe that no one's going to have a problem with this. Because their case also rests on the assumption that this won't be an issue for people. You can just circumcise their babies and everyone will think this is more or less an acceptable thing to do and won't riot in the streets. That means they more or less think that this helps protect them. And in the face of all the misinformation that's out there in the market, you're now saying we found a solution. So now you're actually encouraging people to not use protection. You're encouraging a generation of people to grow up under the belief that because they had the tip of their penis cut off, they have a shield that protects them. And I really wanted a response from their side of the house when I raised a POI. And instead what I got is, in the MO speech, in the MC speech after you've sat down, we got something for that. Cal, please now.
Okay. Generally what we see, okay, it's a long point, but you're going to have to wait.
Sit down.
Okay. All right.
So let's wait. You're not getting 2 minutes in my speech. So let's talk about the real cause of the AIDS pandemic, because I've already alluded to this, right? The fact of the matter is, AIDS is worse in South Africa than any other country in the world. Not because it has, high intravenous drug use, but because, people do not understand what causes HIV. And I've already spoken about how this has been deliberate and open government policy. Something that every single NGO in the world that has ever investigated it has called like a crime against humanity, what's going on. We will never solve AIDS in Africa, and particularly in South Africa, until we have the types of education campaigns that you see in other countries. That is how you fight AIDS. You look to Botswana, you look to Thailand, you look to countries that had the same rates of HIV 10 years ago that South Africa did, and you recognize that they've managed to greatly reduce those rates, that they've managed to greatly reduce the rates of infection, that they've managed to cooperate with the NGOs that give antiretrovirals. And keep in mind, taking antiretrovirals not only prolongs your life, but makes it extremely less likely that you will be able to pass HIV on to a partner. This is something that is much, much more effective than just getting someone circumcised. So I'd also like to highlight at this point that their plan has absolutely no impact for at least 15 years till these people become sexually active. What a useless plan when they're talking about how society rests in the balance and like the country is failing, right? So I think at the end of the day, the most you get out of their entire case is that we have, if we do nothing, right? If we do absolutely nothing, we have some small benefit on our side of the house. There are a million better things that we could do, and that's probably going to be the MO. Well, nothing Rudi said is mutually exclusive. Bullshit, right? So many things are mutually exclusive. If you've got a government that's going to stand behind this as their #1 policy for fighting AIDS and actually make this work, it's going to be at the expense of things that are far more effective. It's an opportunity cost. You can't get up here and say that South African government's all of a sudden benign and we live in a perfect world and all their policies are going to change and all the stuff they said for 30 years. That's all ridiculous. I need to get into the direct refutation. I took a POI, you didn't ask one. Harm reduction, right? So, he said we can't wait for the ideal solution, and I already said your solution sucks. It doesn't come into effect for 15 years, right? He also talked about like babies are being born with HIV. Your plan does nothing to help babies being born with HIV, right? Your plan has nothing to do with antiretrovirals, it has nothing to do with education. Lots of babies will continue being born with this disease. He said it's appropriate, right? He's like, condoms are seen as evil. And so it's awesome because our plan, you don't have to convince people that condoms are good. 1 second. And I've talked about this, right? Now you're actually giving people something better to do than condoms. You create the condoms are evil myth in your society on the government, and then you give people a much less effective solution. That's problematic, Jake.
Unless you have some magical way to educate people perfectly now, how will you buy time for that to work in the future?
Okay, so 2 plans are put forward. You have 15 years to change your education policies and help change people's minds. So you have 15 years to just sort of not do anything and then trust that the small reduction in HIV transmission that will happen in the next generation will be better. We think it's way better to spend all your resources now educating people because that will actually have an impact this year and next year and every single year over the next 15 years. That's why our plan's better. The last thing he talked about was body rights. And he's like, you know what, guys? This is like a vaccine. Well, I've already talked about why it's problematic for people to think this is a vaccine, because it's not a vaccine, right? A vaccine, we allow, in the cases where we do allow the infringement of body rights, and I would argue that like in a developed country at least, we always give an opt-out to vaccines. But even if we're going to accept that we don't, right? Like, it's like a bull that's killing everybody, everyone needs to get this vaccine. We wouldn't give the vaccine unless it was like 99.99999% effective. So if their plan is actually 99.99999% effective, maybe it's not that bad. But it's not, right? Like if you have a lot of unprotected sex, you're still going to get HIV, even if you are circumcised, right? It's not a panacea. It's just marginally better than not being circumcised. So we stand in proud opposition.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. That worked out really well, because a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about today is how not only does this plan not undermine efforts like condom use, education, etc. In fact, it enhances those efforts very, very clearly. I'm going to talk about that for a long time because that's largely what we're facing. Education is a solution, let's do that, this is bad for education. So I'm going to tell you actually why that's all false. So number one, to have an education campaign that is effective, you need 2 things. One is educators. Okay? Teachers, or at least some sort of media, right? The #1 victim in the workforce of AIDS is teachers. They, in fact, were the first hardest hit people in Africa. In fact, when the AIDS pandemic started in Africa, the belief was that, unlike in the United States where they thought it was a homosexual disease, they actually thought it was like something that had to do with some sort of level of education or teaching. That's how common it is among teachers, and it makes a lot of sense, right? Because if you look at sexual activity rates, it is actually much higher, especially in countries like South Africa, in countries like Egypt, among people with higher income levels. Because a lot of sexual activity is with prostitutes, and people who have money can afford prostitutes. So it is actually the teachers and it is the doctors who are dying because of AIDS. That is a problem for education, right? That is a problem when you have far more kids than you have adults. The #2 part of this argument about way too many kids to adults to get educated is that when you have an AIDS pandemic and you have people that want to have the expectation of having maybe 5 children, but there's a 40% chance that each of those children will die upon birth, you overshoot your expectation. You know, it's not too bad to have an extra kid, but you don't have enough children to do the chores, or if you don't have enough children to work the farm, then that's a huge problem. So you will maybe have 8 kids, exceeding the ratio. So every family, in lieu of AIDS, in lieu of this threat, has way more kids than they would normally have. If you significantly reduce the likelihood of your child having AIDS, which every child will have, thank you, what you do as a result of that is you encourage families to realize that maybe it's okay to have fewer kids because there's a lesser likelihood that they're going to die. Let's look at the second part of this. Funding, okay? So we have way more kids than we have teachers, and we don't have very many teachers because they're all dying of AIDS. Funding, the second one. Okay. The problem in South Africa is that they spend 38 times more on their GDP, on healthcare than they would have had to normally if they didn't have the AIDS pandemic. That's just the data on it, right? So if you sort of limit the amount that we're spending on AIDS, ARVs, ARV patents, all those things that treat people with AIDS, if you have 40% less of that under our model, you have 40% more money to spend on education. Plus, you get all of our benefits of 40% to 70% less transmission rates with the circumcision, right? We think that it not in any way undermines the education efforts. In fact, it enhances them. So that's very important. No. Let's talk about misinformation. This is the second very important thing, right? Because when we're talking about misinformation, we're talking about governments going ahead and saying, you know, don't use condoms, don't use birth control, have sex as much as you want because, you know, we should increase our population out of maybe a nationalist sentiment. All kinds of misinformation can be out there. Under our model, the buck stops at birth, right? You already have a check. So no matter how corrupt or evil or misinformed the public is, they have a baseline of safety that means that 40% to 70% less of their population is going to be infected with AIDS. That's fantastic, okay? Plus, if there's less misinformation, which we would say is the case under our model, then you're going to have an even higher reduction in AIDS rates than they do. Okay, #2. So then they say, look, there's going to be riots, people don't like this. I think that the fact here is people are upset and they're rioting because they're poor, because their state is crumbling, because of AIDS. AIDS dominates, permeates African society, especially south of the Sahara. It's a significant harm. If we're going to have any sort of rioting, it's going to be in 15 years when the entire nation state is crumbling under the influence of AIDS. Do you have a view?
Yeah, okay. I'll give you a view right here. Okay, what do you think they're going to say to the government when this actually doesn't stop the spread of AIDS because people aren't using condoms?
Okay,
Do you think that
I have that response, guys. I don't even worry about it, okay? Here's how perception of risk works. I'm going to deal with this now. This is very important. If we went on this, I think perception of risk works such that if you have a baseline sort of common risk level, so for example, I'll use the car analogy, right? So we had very dangerous cars 50 years ago. If you got in a crash at 100 miles an hour, you would die indefinitely. Then we started building more strong bodies, so you could get in a crash and you probably wouldn't die at all. But did that mean people sped more? Did that mean people engaged in more dangerous behavior? In fact, this data tells us no. And then we invented the seatbelt. Then people started putting seatbelts on, and the most recent data on that is in Vietnam, where they most recently had this influx in cars and they started to legalize mandatory seatbelts, right? And we saw in Vietnam, do we see an increase in speeding? Because now people say, oh, I have my seatbelt, I have my circumcision, I can have sex with whoever I want, I have no risk. In fact, again, we saw that there was no increase in speeding or anything like that. So we don't see any increase in risky behavior just because you have this baseline. Moreover, everyone has this standard. So risk is all relative, right? If your risk is relatively high because you're not using a condom and you and everyone else are circumcised but they're all using condoms, you still see that as risky behavior as a rational factor, and thus you're less likely to engage in that behavior because it's just as risky to you because of the relative standards of society, because everyone's circumcised. That's fantastic. Then Rudi's final thing is like, look, this will take 15 years to go into check. All right, well, education's so fantastic, then maybe it'll get us to the 15th year, and then we'll start to see real progress in state development. But until then, we have our teachers and our doctors and our adults, our dependency ratios. Those are the people that are dying. And it's the kids in society without parents telling them they shouldn't have promiscuous sex, without parents telling them about condom use, and they're going up and having these relationships and spreading it. So that's an humongous risk that we have to take care of. So we've dealt with this idea of the shield. People don't see it like that. They see relative perceptions of risk. We see that with the example of the evolution of the car. We see that with the example of just like freaking logic. Okay, so the second idea here that I've also posited to you is this idea of development. To see state development, we need our doctors and our teachers. And yes, Rudi, education is important, but it's simply not cutting it, especially with misinformation. This is a baseline thing that gets rid of sort of like an automatic large percent of our population infected. It doesn't matter what misinformation is out there. Moreover, we have the teachers and the funding because we're not pouring money into AIDS, this black hole that doesn't seem to be getting us really any gains, and AIDS rates are still going up and more people are dying every year. So instead, maybe we should keep our teachers alive so they can teach people. But moreover, we should put everyone in a safer position. Because sure, maybe I'm not going to have promiscuous sex, but it's in my best interest to have everyone around me circumcised such that I don't get infected. Moreover, even if I'm not even engaging in sex, that my society isn't crumbling, that my teachers are healthy, that my doctors are healthy, that my politicians are the best they can be, that people aren't tired and getting sick and lazy and coughing and discouraged and degraded. All those things are very, very important. That mothers aren't encouraged to have too many children, that society isn't overwhelmed by this disease, overpopulation, and its demise. For all these reasons, we beg to oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to leader of the opposition.
It's okay for the time. Yeah, no, it's one sheet less. Okay, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to get into some of my constructive arguments right now. We're really going to crystallize this right for you. Because this is we don't think that this is like a good thing for body rights. We don't think this is a justified abrogation. Because we don't think that this plan will be effective. And we also just think that there are better ways of doing this that's really going to be speech. So we don't think it justifies this type of abrogation of body rights on the side of the House. We just don't think it's an effective policy. We recognize this as a policy round. If we show you that this isn't going to solve HIV in South Africa, we win the round. So what am I going to talk to you about first? First of all, I'm going to talk to you about body rights and how this actually really, abrogates them, and how we think this is going to take off South Africans when you do this. Okay, so what you have to recognize is that the government, for years, has been telling these people that HIV and AIDS are not connected. So then when you say to a mother who's just had a baby, your baby has to get circumcised to prevent the transmission of HIV, they're going to be really pissed off because they don't even necessarily believe this is true because you haven't educated them to believe it is so. So even if we just think that a lot of people aren't going to want this to happen. So what happens when a lot of people don't like this? Because recognize, Mr. Speaker, that it is a big deal. It actually reduces sexual pleasure in the adult male. It does have an effect. Every single time someone gets circumcised, their ability to enjoy sex later in life is affected. So we do think that people know that. That's one reason why circumcision isn't super popular in South Africa. Also, a lot of Christian groups don't believe in it and actually think that it's wrong. If you go to fundamentalist Christian groups, a lot of them, or a lot of people who have more basic understandings of Christianity, don't think it's in the religion, think this is one of the things making them distinct from Judaism and Islam. A lot of Christians don't do it. And there are a lot of Christians in South Africa who we think would be opposed to this. Anyway, so what happens when people don't want their kids to get circumcised, other than rioting in the street and being really pissed off that the government is being paternalistic and telling you what to do with your child's body? What else happens is that people don't bring their kids to the doctors. Because what they said is it should be done at birth or at the first checkup in the hospital. Well, people don't trust the state because they're trying to get them to distort their children's bodies in the name of fighting a disease that they haven't been educated to believe actually exists. We think fewer people will go to doctors. That's terrible for diagnosis. Because one of the things that they said is one of the biggest risk factors for transmitting HIV right now in South Africa is mother to child. So I think there are going to be a lot of babies that are born with HIV already, right? Circumcision isn't necessarily going to help them not get it. But they're born with HIV already. Their mothers aren't going to take them to the doctors. They won't be diagnosed, and they will die, Mr. Speaker. Speaker. They will be written off, and they will not get the type of attention that they deserve. So we think that this is a big problem, especially when, in South Africa, what you have to acknowledge is the Supreme Court just stopped blocking in allowing antiretrovirals into the country, free antiretrovirals into the country. The Clinton Foundation wants to give free antiretrovirals, and is starting to do so in South Africa. We say if you do that, and if you educate, you can undo all the damage you've done. But at the moment, they haven't put in their policy that we would do this policy of mandatory circumcision only if it was accompanied by education. Because without education, without making people believe that HIV causes AIDS, thank you, Cassie, we don't think that people are going to want this. We think there will be rioting in the street because people don't believe that there is this necessary connection. So we think that that's a huge, huge problem. Also, the other thing that's going to happen is, as Rudi told you, if people don't use condoms and people end up being educated about circumcision and then start to see that, like, oh, this is the way you prevent AIDS, because they're very anti-condoms anyway in South Africa, just because, like, the government hasn't really been pro-condoms for a very long time, or at all, ever. So we think that the problem here is people won't use condoms and will be relying on the circumcision if this does take off. So if this does take off, what you have happen is you still get people transmitting HIV from mother to child, through drugs, and through sexual activity. Because if you have lots of unprotected sex, you're still going to get AIDS, Mr. Speaker. People might even think that they can have more unprotected sex, right? You might think that I'm safer. I can do it more, Mr. Speaker. That's a big problem. So when you don't stop the transmission of HIV, we think in the long term this is bad for the South African government because people will trust them less. Why? Their solution didn't work and people still died of HIV. So we think in terms of a government policy, it would be suicidal for the government to do this. This is really stupid. You have mass pandemonium. People will turn against the government when they realize, upon achieving, the age where they actually start having sex, that they're still getting AIDS, and the government didn't do anything about this. They're going to be really pissed off. We think the government's going to have a lot of problems. Then there will really be rioting in the streets, Mr. Speaker.
If the amount of babies who go on to get AIDS drops 30% in 1 year, couldn't you expect a massive increase in the ability to spend on all these other solutions that you're talking about? Even the baby who's born in the hospital in AIDS, now there's money to take care of him or her. There's money to spend on all this stuff.
Okay. Free antiretroviral drugs are being given to South Africa. They're not really paying a lot on antiretrovirals, which are more effective for stopping the transmission of HIV anyway, as Rudi told you, than circumcision even. Okay? So it's not like we have to deal with this expense thing. But also, you can't do this before an education campaign because people just don't believe that there's this kind of connection. And even then, because people are so ignorant, if you start educating them really quickly, we think that there's a risk that they're just going to see that this is like a condom substitute, and it's not. A condom is still massively more effective. A condom is 99.9% effective, like a vaccine. This is not as effective as a vaccine. We think that it's better to give people their body rights and say, you can or cannot have circumcision depending on what you want to do for your child, but please use condoms and give out free condoms in the street. We don't think it's a necessary abrogation of body rights. There are lots of things we could do to make people healthier in the world, Mr. Speaker. Why don't we do them? Because we want to trust people to have their own enjoyment of their body. One way we could make people healthier, Mr. Speaker, would be to lock up people with HIV and say never have sex again. Just don't transmit it. We don't do that, Mr. Speaker. We don't prevent them from having sex. We don't make it illegal for them to have sex with a condom. Because that would be an aberration of body rights that people wouldn't put up with and wouldn't be very popular, Mr. Speaker. And it just wouldn't be fair. That's not the type of world we want to live in. Similarly, if I don't want my child to have circumcision because maybe I had a really bad experience with it, because there are some bad experiences with it. A lot of men who've had circumcision find it hard to get erections and believe that there is this causal link because their penis is less sensitive. We think that this is just going to turn you against the government, and you might think that this is just stupid because it's not even 100% effective anyway. So now let's get into some direct refutation of what Cal said. So he said the biggest problem in South Africa is that teachers are the ones getting HIV and doctors are the ones getting HIV, or at least they were originally. We say this doesn't help anything for 30 years because you're not circumcising these people, or at least you're not doing mandatory circumcision, they already have HIV. So it doesn't help to deal with the problem of not having teachers and doctors. Secondly, what I want to say to you is that in the initial stages of infection, that this was one of the highest groups to get infected. Why isn't this the case anymore? Yes, they can afford prostitutes, but doctors and lawyers are the most likely, and teachers are the most likely to be educated enough to question the government's belief that HIV doesn't cause AIDS. So they're the most likely to actually use condoms. It's protected time. They're most likely to actually use condoms anyway, and so their rates of infection are going down. So we think the upper middle class now is safer. So we think 30 years from now, on our side of the house, without implementing this plan, you you still have more teachers and doctors, but this doesn't do anything in the short term on their side of the house. We don't think it's worth abrogating body rights and forcibly taking off the tip of someone's penis in order to do this. Like, seriously, just think about what you're forcing people to do. That's a really big thing. Like, it's a huge thing. It's genital mutilation, Mr. Speaker, and according to some people. So what else did he talk about? He talked about, like, now people will have fewer kids because they're less likely to die. But you can still have the mother-to-child transition, and it's still massively likely, if you're not using condoms and people aren't educated, that your children will die. So we don't think you're going to have massive population control. And also, people won't notice this if their kids are living to adulthood, even if this is true, and for like 18 years. So you're not dealing with that. They talk about how antiretrovirals are expensive. Well, the Clinton Foundation wants to give them out for free and has now started doing so because the Supreme Court is finally letting them. We don't even think, we think it's very easy for South Africa to deal with antiretrovirals, which Rudi told you are even more effective in preventing the transmission of HIV than taking away someone's foreskins by force, which we even think would alienate people from taking their children to the doctors to begin with, which is terrible. Because not only because they die of HIV, but they could die of, like, the flu, Mr. Speaker, like, really, really simple things. Then, like, we have Cal's weird car analogy. Okay, like, it's so stupid, first of all. Like, it's a weird analogy. It's cars in, like, North America and Vietnam. But also, we see that the safer cars get, the more stupid things people do. Texting while driving is a huge problem, Mr. Speaker, and people crash because of it. Because they think, oh, if I get into a fender bender, my airbags will save me. So his idea about protecting people doesn't make them riskier isn't actually true. Protecting people and giving protection does make them think that they are Teflon and that they can do whatever they want. We do think that if you tell people circumcision makes you 60% more likely to get HIV, that just the psychology of it is, in a culture where they're not crazy about condoms anyway because they aren't socially used to using them, they'll be less likely to turn to condoms, and condoms are more effective in what we want to do. So at the end of the day, what have we proven to you? We think that these plans are mutually exclusive with more education, at least effective education, saying use condoms, HIV does cause AIDS. Rudi told you that South Africa is different from other countries. They haven't used this type of education. That has worked in Botswana. It has worked in Thailand. They haven't tried it yet. You still have the Minister of Health saying, just take a hot shower, Mr. Speaker. In a climate where you're still doing things like this, circumcision alone isn't enough. And also people won't believe you that they need to get their kids circumcised because they don't believe you that HIV causes AIDS, right? We think that their plan might be somewhat effective in the long term, but probably won't be because we've shown you people won't necessarily get it, and they won't use condoms because they'll think that, this is a cure-all if you do get them to believe that this is effective. We don't think it's an abrogation of body rights that you can justify. Vaccines are 99% effective and you can usually opt out. But in this case, it's not completely effective. We think it affects people in a really profound way, and we don't think it is that effective. It isn't the best way to deal with HIV in South Africa.
Your position that I think I'm understood for his key argument.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think we win this round because opposition's case largely depended only upon effectiveness, and I think that's actually the strongest grounds for us to argue on. So I know, I'll respond to this stuff about body rights, but I just don't think that that was as convincing as effective. So I'll deal with the rest of the stuff, and I'll show you that there's a marginal improvement, and that this is a good policy that you ought to implement. A few specific points of rebuttal, and then I'll sum up the round in 2 questions. The first thing is about people not bringing their kids to doctors. This is ridiculous. People eventually have to interact with the state, even when they send their kids to kindergarten, Mr. Speaker. Eventually the state will know that this child exists and this child is not circumcised. All you are doing is you are delaying the act for your child, and you are inviting a worse harm upon that child in the future. Parents care about their children, they probably will bring them to the doctor anyway. Secondly, this thing about educating them first and then circumcising them. This is a weird response, because then it's principally consistent with actually circumcising kids as a solution. Right, Mr. Speaker? But secondly, then if that's their response, at which point have you educated them sufficiently? Because there is nothing in the status quo that changes on their side of the house. You will never educate them sufficiently to the point at which they understand the mechanics of the infection itself, and that's why it's necessary to do the circumcision right now. It's actually specifically because people don't believe you in South Africa that we think that it is necessary to circumcise everyone. In Canada, people do believe you, so you don't need to force it upon them. enforce this procedure upon people so that even in the presence of misinformation, you can buy time for solutions to work. This last thing is about body rights. So interesting point, you don't jail people who have HIV, but you do call it a crime if someone has sex with another person without disclosing that they are infected with HIV/AIDS. Why is that the case, Mr. Speaker? Because what you are actually doing is visiting an active harm upon another person. You are not fulfilling your societal duty to be a responsible actor to control the transmission of a disease that influences the viability of your nation. I think your buy-in to circumcision is part of your responsibility, just like your responsibility to participate in a draft, something you do as a responsible citizen. 2 questions to sum up the round. 1, does circumcision have a useful effect? Rudi's objection first is that it's not perfect. Is this really an objection to reducing risk at all? If you could give everyone a pill that reduced their risk of transmission by 60%, would you not do it because it's not perfect? If I have one way to protect myself, like a condom, that can break, and I have another way to protect myself, like circumcision, that can save my life, would I not do it? Is that really the standard that we have for risk reduction? The second thing is Rudi says, you'll still get it eventually. Maybe you won't. Why is that? Because there's a period in someone's life when they are most at risk for getting AIDS. It's 5 to 10 years before they are settled down, Mr. Speaker. So if you can protect them within this time span enough, then after this risk period is over, they won't get it eventually. What they need is the reduced risk of transmission to make it through those years. The second question then, is there less condom use? No. Because not only is it like seatbelts, which were introduced and people might have, it's still a baseline risk, you always want to reduce it, right? But furthermore, circumcision is all you've known, right? It's not like you were born and you're like, oh, I got circumcised, I can act more risky now. Whether someone acts more risky is based on someone's education, but it's not going to be because of the circumcision, because everyone is circumcised. It's the default option. So you evaluate your risk relatively. Secondly, is it part of a successful campaign? Is circumcision part of a successful campaign? Alternatives are important. We'd be crazy to say that you should not educate people. Do you want to educate them and buy time by circumcising them first? Yes. Because how do you educate people when they die in the meantime? How do you make it possible for them to understand the full effects of this disease, to have societal change, if you cannot afford to have the education 20 and 30 years down the line? Does it work together? Yes, because what circumcision does is it has an expressive force. It says everyone must do this, even in the face of misinformation. A responsible state would propose.